Welcome to Polaris-Live. This is your host, Sarwar Kashmeri. Thank you for joining us today for the discussion in our series focused on the US-China relationship and its global implications as seen through the eyes of experts from around the world. This user-supported channel is brought to you live in conjunction with the Foreign Policy Association of New York. If you have questions for today's guest, please feel free to submit them using the bar on the right-hand side of the screen. After the live event, you can also listen to these programs on your favorite podcast platform. The resurgence of great power rivalry, primarily between the United States and China, has not pushed middle and smaller states back into Cold War-style camps. Instead, much of the global South has become more assertively non-aligned, carving out independent strategic space, something that would have been very difficult to do just a decade ago. Why is this? How are the US and China adjusting to this seismic change in geopolitics, or are they? To help sort all this out, we are fortunate to have with us today Ambassador Jorge Heine. Ambassador Heine is a lawyer, international relations scholar, and diplomat with a special interest in the international politics of the global South. He has served as ambassador of Chile to India, South Africa, China, and as a cabinet minister to the Chilean government. Ambassador Heine is a non-resident fellow at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. He is widely published, including his latest bestseller, The Nonaligned World, Striking Out in an Era of Great Power Competition. Welcome to Polaris-Live, Ambassador Heine. It's so nice to have you back with us again.
Thank you for the opportunity, Sarwar. Always great to be with you.
Listen, during the US-Soviet bipolar rivalry, middle and smaller states were pushed into Cold War-style camps as non-alignment proved unworkable. Now, your timely new book promotes the idea that this is not the case today. Much of the global South countries are carving out an independent strategic space for themselves. So what accounts for this dramatic change?
Well, what is very important to keep in mind is the following. We're going through a very difficult period in world affairs. People talk about the Polycrisis. We have wars, pandemics, famines, droughts, natural disasters, all sorts of problems. Now, at the core of this Polycrisis, though, I would argue, is very much this competition between the United States and China. Now, some people make the parallel and say that we are in a new Cold War, as it were. And obviously, there's some parallels. The United States is there as it was in the Cold War. It competes with a state that calls itself communist, which is China, much as the Soviet Union did. But there is a key difference. The difference is this. The Soviet Union was a significant superpower, nuclear power, space power, military power, ideological power. But it had a smaller economy than the US. It also had a closed economy. What does this mean? That it couldn't provide the sort of trade flows, investment flows, financial cooperation flows that developing countries needed and wanted. That is very different from the situation today. In PPP terms, the Chinese economy is larger than the US economy, has been so since 2014. According to some projections, it will be larger in nominal terms by 2030 or at least by 2035. And it also is a more open economy than the US. It generates considerable investment and trade. For 130 countries around the world, China is the number one trading partner, which is many more than call the US their number one trade. So for all these reasons, countries in the developing world today have options that they didn't have before. And that what opens the possibility of what we call active non-alignment.
You've used that phrase quite a bit, active non-alignment. Can we take a moment just so you can describe it for us?
Sure. What active non-alignment is, it's a foreign policy approach that calls for countries, we're talking mostly about the developing world, the global south, to put their own interests front and center. They refuse to align themselves with either Washington or Beijing. They set their own priorities and they make the decisions accordingly. Now, this is not an easy task. It demands a very sophisticated diplomacy that is able to evaluate each issue on its own terms. But what it means is that instead of saying, I will side with the United States or I will side with China, it means that they set their own priorities front and center. Now, what is the reason for this? The reason for this, the moment you side with one of the great powers, you give up your leverage. You are in that camp, and therefore you can't get many things that you would otherwise want to have. If you don't do that, if you stay in the middle, as it were, you can bargain. You can say, well, I want to build a port. Who offers the best conditions? I want to build a railway. Who offers the best conditions? I need bridges. I need tunnels. The things the developing countries do need. And active non-alignment provides them with the best approach to that.
But Mr. Ambassador, for this change to be effective, the US and China themselves have to be less rigid, right? For instance, Saudi Arabia hosts US forces while they are members of BRICS, as the grouping of Brazil, Russia, India, and China, South Africa are called. So do you see this also happening, that China and America are successfully trying to adjust to this geopolitical change?
Well, they don't have much of a choice, and Saudi Arabia is still mulling over. It was invited to join the BRICS. It's still mulling it over. But let me give you a recent example that illustrates this, it seems to me, very dramatically. A few days ago, on November 6th, the five presidents of the Central Asian republics met with President Trump in the White House. The first time a US president meets with these five presidents. It's never happened before, let alone in the White House, in the heart of the US Capitol. Why is this so revealing? Because these are nations that are neighbors, both to Russia and to China. These five Central Asian republics, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, and so on, Turkmenistan, were former Soviet republics. And so they are, caught in a bit of a bind in relations with, the former Soviet Union, its successor state now, the Russian Federation, on the one hand, and China, this behemoth that they have on their borders. So you would think that given the tensions between Russia and China on the one hand, and the United States on the other, they will be very reluctant to engage with the Trump administration. But They are doing it. Why are they doing it? Because they have the option. They can do it. They say, we will balance our relations with Moscow and with Beijing. But this does not mean that we will give up on the opportunities offered by the international system today, which means that we can also engage the United States. So it works both ways. Latin American countries can engage China. Central Asian republics can engage the United States.
Well, it's just fascinating. I'm also, in the days when non-aligned countries first began, you had Mr. Sukarno from Indonesia and Jawaharlal Nehru from India, who kind of led the growth of the old non-aligned movement. Mm-hmm. What's happening to the leadership today? Or is it more organizations like ASEAN and BRICS and Quad, which are assuming more of a leadership role as opposed to individual countries? Can you just dwell on that for us a bit?
Sure. Well, no, you're quite right. In the 50s and 60s, we had these extraordinary leaders, Jawaharlal Nehru, Prime
Douglas, we seem to be freezing on the technology side from Chile.
Minister of India. There are important leaders in today's world, but as you quite rightly say, there are a number of other organizations like the BRICS, like ASEAN, they play a key role. Now,
We're starting to break up the conversation, Mr. Ambassador. Your internet seems to be freezing. Douglas, if you can hear me, can you send him a message? Please stand by.
Can you hear me?
Now we can hear you.
Okay.
So
sorry about that. Let's go back to your question.
Let's go back to the question that I asked you, which is that we had in the old days of the non-aligned movement, Nehru, Sukarno from India, Indonesia, as leaders of the movement. And I was asking you if now, instead of personal leadership, it's more organizations like ASEAN and BRICS and Quad and so on. So if you don't mind, this is a very important question. Please go ahead. And if we need to run over, we'll run over. Go ahead, please.
Sure. So the point is this. Yes, you're quite right about the stature of those leaders of the NAM in the 50s and 60s. But I would argue that today we have a leader that I would put in that same category, and that is President Lula of Brazil. President Lula is now in his third term. I was recently in Brazil. He will be running for re-election for a fourth term. And, you know, according to the polls, there's a strong possibility he would be re-elected for that. And he, you know, stands very significantly in world affairs. There's a reason why Brazil chaired the G20 in 2024. The summit was held in Sao Paulo. Then this year, it chaired the BRICS summit that was held in Rio de Janeiro in July. And now, of course, it is chairing COP30 that is being held in Belém. So Brazil has become a real hub of international diplomacy, and the role that President Lula plays in that regard is very significant. So I would argue that he is also perhaps the most significant practitioner of active non-alignment. His foreign minister, now chief foreign policy advisor, Celso Amorim, has a chapter in an earlier book of us on active non-alignment. And he is, you know, handling it seems to me, very well.
May I ask you for a quick clarification, Jorge? Is the global South countries, the phrase, the meaning is the same as non-aligned countries?
Well, I would, it doesn't necessarily mean the same. what we argue in the book is that in the course of the past 3 years, we have had a real rise of the Global South.
Yes.
I mean, the Global South obviously has been around for a long time, but its political significance has become especially prominent in the 2023-2025 period. There is a reason why Foreign Policy magazine called 2023 the year of the Global South. And why is that? Because we have had 3 significant events that have propelled the Global South to the forefront of world politics. One of them was the reaction to the war in Ukraine, in which many countries across the Global South, led by India, but also South Africa, Brazil, Pakistan, others, did not stand with the West, with NATO, on its stance on the war in Ukraine. That's number one. Number two, we have had, of course, BRICS expansion. You alluded to the BRICS group. In 2023, in the Johannesburg summit, my old stomping grounds, the BRICS group invited a number of new members. Now the BRICS, instead of 5, has 10 members, including Indonesia, which is the 4th largest country in the world, largest Muslim majority country in the world. And third, the war in Gaza, in which there has been a very strong reaction across Africa, Asia, and Latin America against the Western support to what many consider a genocidal war that Israel has waged in Gaza in reaction to the October 7 Hamas attack, of course, but in what many would consider to be a very disproportionate reaction with the deaths of nearly 70,000 Palestinians, 20,000 children. And that has elicited strong reaction in South Africa, which took this case to the International Court of Justice. Brazil, in the UN Security Council, has also been calling for ceasefire. Other countries have taken a significant stance as well. So all of these things have pushed the Global South to the forefront of international affairs. And this means that active non-alignment has become especially prominent because in many ways, the natural foreign policy of the Global South is active non-alignment.
Mr. Ambassador Jorge, I want to ask you a question that I've not had a chance to ask a foreign non-American leader and expert before, and that is the recent mayoral election in New York. Mm-hmm. It used to be that one could not break with Israel, one could not be a Muslim to win the leadership contest in the largest city in America. Well, here we have a new mayor elect on January 1. We'll have a socialist, we'll have a Muslim, we'll have Mamdani. How is the non-aligned world, do you think, looking at it? Or perhaps it would be more fair to ask you how you're looking at it.
Well, I think it's an extraordinary thing. Mr. Mamdani is obviously a very talented young man that speaks a language that with which people in New York identify with. I often say that at my age, I've often find myself in a situation in which I know the parents of my interlocutors. As it happens, I happen to know the parents of Mr. Mamdani. His father is a prominent Ugandan political scientist whom I had the chance to meet when I was in South Africa in the 90s. And his mother, of course, Miraner, is a leading Indian film director who has made some first-rate films that have won the Oscar. So I happen to know his parents. I haven't met him. But from all I hear, he is an extremely talented man that, will bring the needs of New Yorkers, the issue of affordability, to the forefront. And I think it's very exciting. We'll see how he does. Obviously, good intentions are not enough. Often young leaders that are imbued with good intentions do not necessarily have the skills to navigate complex bureaucracies. So it seems to me that is going to be a critical point. But let us keep our fingers crossed. that things go well. There's certainly much hope in my New Yorker friends.
Well, one has to see, as he so wisely said, that you campaign in poetry, but you govern in prose. So, as you say, we have to see how it goes. But my intent was to ask you that just the fact a Muslim and a socialist was elected mayor of the financial capital of the entire world must send some kind of an encouraging message on its own to the non-aligned, the global South world. You think that is the case?
Well, absolutely. I think what Mr. Andani has done, he has shown that, somebody from his background can rise to, one of the highest levels in US politics.
Yes.
Now, the question is, again, how he performs. So we'll watch him closely and, wish him the best.
Yes. And must be very perplexing for the rest of the world to see Mr. Trump elected and Mr. Mamdani elected. But that's who we are, right?
That's right.
Now, listen, let me take a moment to remind viewers that Polaris-Live is a commercial-free and entirely viewer-supported program. You can view us on YouTube and your favorite podcast channels. And as a new item, an executive summary of each program is sent at no cost to our Substack subscribers. Now, you can help us by keeping our commercial-free model strong by becoming an annual supporting subscriber through my website, kashmeri.com, or through Substack. We always welcome your comments on our video podcast channels. Coming back to Ambassador Jorge Heine, over the last 3 decades, the free world has been interconnected by numerous pipelines that provide ready-made trading routes. So, Jorge, ready-made options to replace trade routes blocked by one or the other superpower must also play an important role in the kind of change you're talking about, right? Because previously, if one or two pipelines were blocked, one or two countries were sanctioned, then things pretty much came to a stop. But is that also a reason that we have this openness now and flexibility?
Well, absolutely. What we have is an interesting phenomenon. Over the past 40, 45 years, we have had, of course, a steady expansion of globalization, which started in 1980. Some people say that it's because that was the year that CNN came on stream, the first 24-hour news cycle came on stream, and also the first PC, the first personal computer came online, so the IT revolution was really kickstarted in some ways then. So, and the next, I would argue 35 years until 2015 or 2016 brought great progress to the world, to humanity. Many hundreds of millions of people were lifted from poverty, and it was an era of much progress. Now that is now being questioned. There's a strong movement to de-globalize the world, to erect trade barriers, to make international exchanges more difficult. And it's ironic because I would argue that it's countries like China, like India, like my own country, Chile, that benefited the most from globalization. And countries in the north that were expected to benefit the most, in fact, had some issues. They lost some factories, lost some jobs, and that's why this unhappiness came about. My own take is that for countries in the global south, a more open economy, a more globalized economy is the best way forward. And the way I see it is, if the United States wants to erect trade barriers and wants to shut himself off from the rest of the world, well, so be it. And the rest of the world will continue to push for a more global and open economy.
I want to ask you a question which might be a little difficult, but let's try to get to it anyway. And that is, I'm talking now about the new administration in America, which is pushing the power of the presidency farther than it has ever gone. Right. My question to you is, having done so, do you think that another administration, when it comes, will now have a precedent to be much more aggressive? And if so, if you were advising the non-aligned countries how to look ahead, I mean, how would you factor all this? I realize it's a not well parsed question, but it was on my mind and I thought I would ask you.
Sure. Well, I will say two things. One of them, I was living in the United States until June of this year. So
Yeah.
I had a chance to follow quite closely what was happening. And it seems to me that one of the great question marks that has arisen is about the strength of US institutions. We all assumed for a very long time that the US, that is often described as the oldest democracy in the world, at least in the modern period, and that its institutions were very strong, that they were able to withstand any arbitrary efforts to abuse them. Well, that has not necessarily proven to be true. And we have had, an assumption of executive power in a way that we have not seen before, and that has not been seen in many countries around the world. So that I find extremely disturbing. It obviously sets a precedent for future administrations, which makes it problematic. All executives will want to have and enjoy the powers that their predecessors did. So this is very worrisome. And I'm concerned about the ways in which US institutions will be able to respond to this. I feel there hasn't been much pushback, and it's a very concerning development. Now, in terms of the rest of the world, obviously, the rest of the world has to engage the United States. I mentioned earlier the case of the leaders of the Central Asian republics that have done that. The whole point of active non-alignment is not to take a stand against one or another great power. The whole point of active non-alignment is to make the most of the current situation, try to keep strong and good relations with both powers, in this case with Washington and with Beijing, and keep a very workable equilibrium between the two. That, it seems to me, is the secret to success. And let me again go back to the example that I mentioned earlier of President Lula. President Lula of Brazil, as you know, had a very difficult time with President Trump. He was slammed 50% tariffs on Brazilian exports to Brazil, all sorts of sanctions on judges and so on. He stood his ground, and then they met at the UN General Assembly. Brazil gives the first speech, the United States gives the second speech. They met on the way to the dais, and they later spoke on the phone, and they recently had a one-on-one meeting, tried to sort this out. So this is what you do. You talk to people, and you sort things out. And that, it seems to me, is the way forward for countries in the developing world.
Yes, we talked to a professor from China not long ago on Polaris-Live, and he made the point during the Cold War, the saying used to be trust but verify. Mm-hmm. And he said today the saying needs to be trust but keep talking. And that's I think you're kind of making the same point here. As we run into the closing segment of this program, I want again for you to tell people why your book, as I think it is timely and important and very much in keeping with strategic development in the chancelleries of the world.
Yes, well, let me say this. Our concept of active non-alignment arose in 2019, 2020. My colleagues, Carlos Fortini and Carlos Uneri, were all three Chilean social scientists and practitioners. And at the time, Latin America was hit by a triple whammy. The pandemic, the ensuing recession, and pressures from the Trump administration, as well from China, to toe their respective lines. We said, this is bad. We need a way out. We need an approach We need a guide to action. We need a compass to navigate these very troubled waters. And for the past 5 years, we have been developing that. We published 2 books in Spanish, in English, in every volume now, this monograph. And what has happened is that the second Trump administration has only increased the need for such an approach, because the pressure is now even more significant than it was, 5-6 years ago. So in that sense, what I find quite remarkable is that this notion that arose in Latin America has now caught on in Africa and in Asia. South Africa has proclaimed active non-alignment. It's its official foreign policy doctrine. I was recently in India. In India, where, of course, non-alignment originally arose, this has also become very important given the difficulties India has been finding with the United States in terms of tariffs, in terms of the US siding with Pakistan on the war and other measures. So what we find is that this notion that came up in Latin America to address a particular moment is now spread to the rest of the global South and has gained a considerable traction. So we think it is a very useful tool. It is not ideological. This is not right or left or centrist. It's a practical guide to action. I've been an ambassador for 12 years to 3 significant countries. So I have had the chance to be in the room when these decisions are made. And we think this is a very useful tool. It provides diplomats and foreign policymakers with a useful toolkit to handle these difficult situations.
So Douglas, our producer, if it is possible, as I thank the ambassador for appearing here yet again, is it possible to show the cover of his book so our people can then buy it? And it's also, I believe, we've put it on on my website. So Ambassador Heine, we have alas run out of time, and I want to thank you so very much for that thought-provoking perspective. I do hope you'll come back and see us yet again.
Thank you for the opportunity, Sarwar. Always a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you. And thank you to our viewers from around the world. Please join us again on Polaris-Live.com as we continue to explore the most consequential relationship in the world, that between the United States and China, and its impact on all the countries of the world. Until then, goodbye.